I died on March 15, 2019, at 11:47 p.m. I know the exact time because I checked my watch obsessively that night. I was having a heart attack in my office at Caltech, alone, surrounded by equations I've been working on for 15 years. Equations that were supposed to prove that consciousness was nothing more than electrical impulses in meat, that when you died, you just stopped. I was wrong. My name is Tyler, and for 32 years I've been a quantum physicist. I've published over 100 papers. I've won awards. I've dedicated my entire adult life to understanding the fundamental nature of reality through mathematics and empirical observation. I didn't believe in God. I didn't believe in souls. I certainly didn't believe in an afterlife. But here's the thing about being a scientist, a real scientist. When the data changes, you change your mind. And on that night in March, the data changed completely. Let me take you back to those final moments. I was working late, as usual. My wife had stopped asking me to come home at reasonable hours years ago. The pain started in my chest, a crushing sensation, like someone had wrapped a steel band around my ribcage and was slowly tightening it. I knew immediately what it was. My father died of a heart attack at 53. I was 51. I reached for my phone, but my left arm had gone completely numb. The room started to tilt. I remember thinking, with absolute clarity, this is it, this is how it ends. Alone, in an office, surrounded by equations that won't matter in about 3 minutes. There was no tunnel of light. Not at first. What happened instead was mathematics. I know how that sounds. But stay with me, because this is where it gets interesting. As my vision started to dim, I began to see equations. Not on paper, not in my mind's eye. I saw them, hovering in the air like they were written in light. But these weren't equations I'd ever worked with before. They were beautiful, impossibly complex. They described dimensions I'd only theorized about, compactified spaces that existed beyond our observable universe. And then I understood them. All of them. Simultaneously. You have to understand. I'd spent decades trying to unify quantum mechanics with general relativity. It's the holy grail of physics. Einstein couldn't do it. Hawking couldn't do it. Nobody has done it. But in that moment, dying on my office floor, I could see the solution. It was right there, written in light, and it was so obvious I almost laughed. The universe isn't four-dimensional. We know that theoretically, string theory requires 10 or 11 dimensions, depending on which model you use. But we can't perceive them because they're compactified, rolled up so small that they're functionally invisible at our scale. But consciousness exists in those other dimensions. That's when I left my body. I don't mean that poetically. I was suddenly looking down at myself from the ceiling. There was my body, slumped against the desk, face down on a printout of a paper I'd been reviewing. There was the coffee cup I'd filled 3 hours earlier, still half full. There was the photograph of my daughter on my desk. She was 7 in that picture, grinning with her 2 front teeth missing. I felt nothing about the body on the floor. It wasn't me anymore. It was just matter. Organized matter that had temporarily housed something else, something that was now free. And then the room started to shift. You know how in physics we talk about phase transitions, like when water becomes ice, or ice becomes steam. The molecular structure is the same, but it's reorganized into a completely different state. That's what happened to reality. The walls of my office began to unfold. That's the only word I have for it. They unfolded like origami in reverse, revealing dimensions that had always been there but that my 3-dimensional brain had been incapable of processing. It was like spending your whole life looking at a shadow on a wall and suddenly realizing the shadow was being cast by an object infinitely more complex than you could have imagined. I could see through time. Past, present, and future weren't separate things anymore, they were just different positions in a higher dimensional space. I could see myself as a child, learning to solve my first equations. I could see myself meeting my wife. I could see my daughter being born. But I could also see things that hadn't happened yet, or that hadn't happened in the timeline I'd been living in. The implications were staggering. Free will and determinism weren't opposites. They were both true, depending on which dimension you were observing from. From our 3D perspective, trapped in linear time, we experience choice. But from a higher dimension, all choices exist simultaneously in a quantum superposition. Every decision creates a branch. Every possibility is real. Then, I saw them. I've struggled with how to describe this part because we don't have the language for it. We don't even have the mathematics for it. Not completely. But there were beings, entities, composed of pure information, existing in these higher dimensions. They weren't angels. They weren't demons. They were more like patterns, complex, self-aware patterns that existed at a level of reality we can't normally perceive. And here's what broke my brain. I recognized them. One of them was my father. Not my father as I'd known him. Not the stern, disappointed man who'd wanted me to be a doctor instead of a physicist. This was my father as he truly was, stripped of all the limitations and fears and ego that had defined him in three-dimensional space. This was his consciousness, his essential pattern, existing in its natural state. And he was trying to tell me something. Communication at that level doesn't happen through words. It happens through direct information transfer. Imagine understanding someone's entire thought, complete with all the emotional context and logical reasoning, in a single instant. That's what it was like. He showed me that consciousness is a quantum phenomenon. Our brains don't generate consciousness. They receive it, like a radio receiving a signal. The brain is a transducer, taking information from higher dimensions and filtering it down into something that can operate in three-dimensional space with linear time. When the brain dies, the signal doesn't stop. It just stops being filtered. That's what we call the afterlife. It's not a place. It's a state of being in higher dimensional space where consciousness exists in its pure form. And here's the really wild part. This isn't mysticism. This is physics. Let me explain. In quantum mechanics, we have something called the observer effect. The act of observation collapses a wave function from multiple possible states into a single definite state. Consciousness plays a fundamental role in determining reality. That's not woo-woo spirituality. That's the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, taught in every undergraduate physics course. But what's doing the observing? Where does consciousness come from? The equations I saw suggested that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, like mass or charge. It exists in higher dimensions and interacts with matter through quantum processes in the brain, specifically quantum coherence in microtubules, which several physicists, including Roger Penrose, have proposed as the seat of consciousness. When your body dies, the quantum coherence that links your higher dimensional consciousness to your physical brain collapses. But the consciousness itself, the pattern, the information, that persists in higher dimensional space. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. If consciousness is a form of energy, a form of information, then it must persist. It must go somewhere. I was seeing where, my father's pattern, and I was starting to understand that calling it my father was limiting, because he was also experiencing all his other simultaneous existences across different probability branches. My father's pattern was showing me the mathematical structure of this space. It was governed by principles similar to, but more complex than the standard model of particle physics. There were forces, interactions, even something like physics, but the physics of consciousness, not matter, the rules that governed how information and awareness organize themselves in these higher dimensions. And I realized, this is what mystics and religious teachers have been trying to describe for thousands of years. Nirvana, heaven, the Tao, the collective unconscious, they were all attempts to describe this higher dimensional space, using the limited vocabulary and conceptual frameworks available in their time. They weren't wrong, they just didn't have the mathematics. But I did, or at least I was seeing it. The equations were still there, still visible, still making perfect sense. I knew that if I could just remember them, if I could bring them back, I could prove all of this. I could show the world that consciousness survives death, not as a matter of faith, but as a matter of physics. That's when I felt the pull. It was like gravity, but in a direction that doesn't exist in three-dimensional space. Something was pulling me back toward my body. I didn't want to go. I was understanding things, seeing things, experiencing things that I'd spent my whole life trying to understand. The secrets of the universe were right there, and I was being pulled away from them. My father's pattern pulsed. I can't describe it better than that. And I understood. I had a choice. I could continue into the higher dimensions, leave the physical world behind permanently, or I could go back. But if I went back, I wouldn't remember everything. The human brain can't hold this much information. It's like trying to download the entire internet onto a calculator. The structure isn't there to support it. I'd remember some. Impressions, feelings, fragments of equations. But not all of it. I chose to come back. Why? Because of my daughter. I could see her in the timeline, see all the moments we hadn't had yet. Her graduation, her wedding, grandchildren I hadn't met. And I could see the timeline where I didn't come back, where she spent the rest of her life wondering why her father had chosen work over family. Even at the very end, I couldn't do that to her. The transition back was violent. Those higher dimensions folded back in on themselves, collapsing back into the three-dimensional space I was familiar with. It felt like being crushed and expanded simultaneously. The equations that had been so clear, so obvious, started to fade like a dream upon waking. And then I was gasping, choking, my chest on fire, sprawled on the floor of my office with a janitor standing over me, phone in hand, screaming at a 911 operator. I'd been dead for 4 minutes. The doctor said it was a miracle. Wrong place, wrong time. But the janitor happened to be walking by. He knew CPR. The ambulance arrived in record time. I had a 95% blockage in my left anterior descending artery. They put in a stent. I was in the hospital for a week. The whole time, I was trying to remember the equations. I filled notebook after notebook with fragments, partial differentials, tensor notations for dimensions beyond the fourth. My cardiologist thought I was having post-traumatic stress. My wife thought I'd lost my mind. My colleagues were sympathetic but clearly concerned. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew it was real. The question was, how could I prove it? I couldn't. Not with the fragments I had. The mathematics was too complex, too incomplete. It was like having 3 pieces of a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle and trying to describe the full picture. But I could do something else. I could approach the problem from the other direction. See, if consciousness exists in higher dimensions and interacts with the physical brain through quantum processes, then there should be measurable effects. Subtle, yes, but measurable. I changed my research focus. Instead of trying to unify quantum mechanics and gravity, I started looking at quantum effects in biological systems, specifically in the brain. And I found something. There are these tiny structures called microtubules inside neurons. They're part of the cell's cytoskeleton, basically the scaffolding that gives cells their shape. But they also exhibit quantum coherence at room temperature, which shouldn't be possible according to classical physics. Several researchers, including Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose, have proposed that these microtubules are where quantum computations happen in the brain, where consciousness interfaces with matter. I took it further. I developed a mathematical model that predicted specific patterns of quantum coherence that should appear if consciousness is indeed sourced from higher dimensions. And then I tested it. The preliminary results, they're consistent with the model. I'm not saying I've proven the afterlife exists. I'm saying I've found mathematical and experimental evidence that consciousness has a quantum component that exists independent of the physical brain, that it's receiving information from somewhere else. The papers are under peer review now. Some colleagues are intrigued. Others think I've gone off the deep end. But the mathematics is sound. The experiments are reproducible. And more researchers are starting to pay attention. Here's what I know now. 5 years after dying on that office floor, death is not the end. It's a phase transition. It's consciousness shifting from one state to another, from being filtered through a physical brain to existing in its pure form in higher dimensional space. The afterlife is real, but it's not a place with clouds and harps. It's a higher dimensional space, governed by laws we're only beginning to understand. Laws that can be described mathematically. Everyone I've lost, my father, my grandmother, colleagues and friends who've passed, they still exist. Not as ghosts, not as memories, but as coherent patterns of information, in a space that my three-dimensional brain can't directly perceive. And when I die, really die, permanently this time, I'll transition to that space. I'll rejoin that pattern. I'll experience existence in a way that's as far beyond my current experience as my current consciousness is. Beyond a single neuron, I'm not afraid anymore. I still don't believe in God, at least not the bearded man in the sky version. But I believe in something, a deeper structure to reality, a mathematical elegance to existence that includes consciousness as a fundamental feature, not a bug. I've spent the last 5 years trying to bridge the gap between science and spirituality, showing that they're not opposites but different ways of describing the same underlying reality. The mystics were right about what they experienced, they just didn't have the tools to describe it in a way that scientists could accept. Now we have those tools. The mathematics of higher dimensions. Quantum field theory. Information theory. We can describe the afterlife not as faith but as physics. My daughter is 18 now. We're close in a way we never were before my heart attack. I make time for her. I make time for my wife. I still work on my research, but it's not the only thing that matters anymore, because I've seen the bigger picture. Literally. And the picture is this. We are not our bodies. We are not even our brains. We are patterns of information, expressions of consciousness, that temporarily inhabit physical form but exist fundamentally in a space beyond space, a time beyond time. We are the universe experiencing itself. We are quantum wave functions that have temporarily collapsed into specific states. And when these bodies cease to function, we don't disappear. We just stop being collapsed. I died for 4 minutes, and in that time I saw more truth about reality than in 3 decades of scientific research. But here's the beautiful part. Those two things aren't contradictory. The mystical experience and the scientific method. They're complementary approaches to the same ultimate truth. The math of the afterlife is real. And one day, I'll prove it completely. But even if I don't, even if I spend the rest of my life chasing equations I only half remember from a 4-minute death, I'll die knowing what's waiting on the other side. Not nothing. Not an end. But a transition to something bigger, something more fundamental, something that I've already experienced once. And when I see those equations again, written in light in dimensions my physical brain can't process, I'll finally understand them completely. I'll be home.